I'm going to tell you a little about the film. Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger wanted Laurence Olivier to play Clive Candy and Wendy Hiller to play the woman. But in order to get Olivier, who was actually in the service at the time, they needed the approval of the Ministry of War, which turned them down. Actually, the speech that Anton Walbrook makes later in the film about the days of civilized rules of war being over.
If you let yourself be defeated by them just because you are too fair to hit back the same way they hit at you, there won't be any methods but Nazi methods.
That was the one that offended the minister. So the army was violently against the film being made, and if it were to be made, they were violently against exporting it. And they really whipped up Winston Churchill against it. So Powell had to go to Roger Livesey, who was working in a munitions factory at the time during the war effort. And of course, he was a sort of a rival to Olivier.
He nearly had a fit when he knew why I'd come. Babyface, I mean. He lugged me in to see the second secretary, and he nearly had a fit too. The possible scandal, you know.
Are you coming to a point, Mr. King?
Yes. The point is that I had to promise to do nothing. And I went bail for you, too.
Oh.
Apparently, it's a matter for careful diplomacy. You can see what they mean.
And it was a very controversial choice because Livesey's voice is very unique and distinct. They said he was never going to work on film because of that. Then Wendy Hiller got pregnant, so he replaced her with Deborah Carr, who was only 20 years old at the time. And this was another controversial decision because they felt she was too young. Can she play these 3 roles in the film? Can she play this range? And the part of Theo, of course, was written for Anton Walbrook, and that stayed as is. And since the production wasn't approved by the Ministry of War, all the uniforms you see and the vehicles and the weapons and everything were pretty much all borrowed.
Theo.
Now, the film was cut down for American release. And this important, I think, moving scene was unfortunately part of the 13 minutes dropped out of the middle of the picture. Originally, it was 163 minutes. It was cut down then to 150 minutes. And then there was a 90-minute version that was shown around for 30 years or so on television, and this is the way I would have first seen it. Now, unlike the Powell Pressburger films, The Red Shoes, or even A Matter of Life and Death, Blimp was hardly ever shown. Even though A Matter of Life and Death was cut, and it was shown in black and white, it was a film that was shown, and it was available on American television, and you knew the film. Of course, The Red Shoes was shown in 35mm in Technicolor. It was not cut. It was shown beautifully in theaters, not very often, but when it was, it had a major following. And people were fascinated by it on television just as they were in the theater, black and white or in color. But Colonel Blimp is a different story. I mean, the first time I became aware of this picture was on television late afternoon. I think I was home early from school, and I was about 12 or 13. And I remember it was an hour and a half with commercials, so it was less than 90 minutes, really. And I remember being very intrigued by the picture.
Come and sit over here, General, will you?
It had a stamp on it that was very special, that had a special sensibility to it.
Come along, nurses. Bed, everyone. Bed, everybody. Come along.
And I remembered it as a very interesting way of visual storytelling, for what I could tell, that made me, over the years, look for it. In other words, as full a version as I could find of it, or did it even really exist? And I always remembered the picture. I even, for a while, thought I dreamt it because I didn't see anything in theaters or repertory theaters in New York in the 50s, nowhere. Now, Raging Bull has a sort of parallel story to it in a way, because at the time we were going to make the film, Raging Bull, Robert De Niro had the plans of gaining about 60 pounds to play the older prize fighter, Jake LaMotta.
Hey, Jake. Come on, Jim. Come on.
We want to use makeup. And at that point, Michael Powell and sometimes Emmerich Pressburger would come to New York and visit us, and in Los Angeles, too. I had gotten to meet Michael in the mid-'70s in London. We became friends, so he'd come back and forth. I'd introduce him to my friends, and talking about so many different things. We would have dinners and talk about films, all kinds of ideas. And the aging of Roger Livesey in Colonel Blimp came up when we were discussing how De Niro wanted to change his physical presence in Raging Bull. And it was asking a lot about how it was done, the makeup and this sort of thing. And so I showed the film to Robert De Niro, keeping in mind that, of course, the film was made in 1943, and there are different technical conventions for the time that audiences would accept. And Bob saw the picture and did say he'd like to meet Michael, talk to him about it. So I said, let's have a little dinner at an apartment on 57th Street here. And I invited Michael and a few other people and Bob De Niro. And Michael at one point looked up and said, well, I understand that Bob De Niro will be coming here. And I said, Michael, he's sitting right next to you. He said, oh. What it was about Bob De Niro was that he was able to sort of fade away into the woodwork. You couldn't tell, he had a humility about him that was actually very sweet and unique, because he would go to places people didn't even notice. And he had this ability to just fade away, and Michael didn't realize it was him sitting next to him. So he looked at him because he was so nondescript, you know. And we began talking about the makeup and the weight and how it was created in 1943. He was asking so many questions about the weight and the makeup, and finally Michael just looked at him and said, it's acting. It's acting. That's how it's done. Of course, those are, 1979, 1943, two different times, two different conventions, and different mindsets. But I was always fascinated by the choices and the storytelling of Powell Pressburger. For example, the big dramatic moments, the duel and the death of his wife, the winning wars, losing wars, all the major events, they just left them out. And what you're left with, what you retain, is the warmth and the love and the friendship, the humorous moments, the tenderness, and a very, very sweet, eloquent sadness.
Would you undo your shirt?
And I was fascinated by how they left out these sections. For example, the duel scene.
Thank you. Right. Do you want to roll up your sleeve, or will you rip it off?
What's better?
I am not permitted to give advice.
I think I'll rip it.
It is definitely better.
Doctor, your scissors, please. What did you hope to find in there?
Protective bandages.
It's really the build-up to the duel which is so specific and so important.
You must stop the combat if you hear the command, halt, whoever may say it.
Every aspect of the build-up to the duel. But the duel itself is irrelevant. And I couldn't believe that Michael Powell had the guts not to show the duel, but instead, as they begin to fight the duel, the camera rises up through the rafters into an overhead shot of Berlin in the snow. And this was a major impact on me when I made Raging Bull, because I was trying to figure out how to do this fight scene in Raging Bull. Now, there was about 9 or 10 minutes of actual fight scenes in the film. Each one has their own style, visually, thematically. In the beginning of the film, he wants to win that championship, wants to be the middleweight champ. He has to get a shot at that title, and he finally gets a shot at the title. Ultimately, when he does the fight for the middleweight champ with Marcel Cerdan, I said to myself, how am I going to do it? What's the philosophy behind it? What's the importance of it? He wins the fight, we know that. And ultimately, I felt the fight was just a device. So why should we even show the fight? And this literally becomes the shot that begins down in the dressing room of the old Olympic Stadium in Los Angeles where we shot it, where De Niro is punching Joe Pesci's padding and saying, I'm the boss, I'm the boss. The shot is directly inspired by the long lead up to the duel in The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, where, as I said, the duel itself is not shown. Now, the Steadicam operator is walking through the corridors in front of De Niro and Pesci. And then he swings around behind them as they enter the stadium. And through the audience, 1,000 people, extras we had that day for half a day. The Steadicam operator then steps onto a crane that lifted him up into an overhead shot as De Niro enters the ring. And then there were a few shots of him fighting, and then he wins the fight. And this interpretation was inspired by the life and death of Colonel Blimp. Because this freedom, it allowed me to emphasize, rather than the plot and something literal, it was really emphasizing more the drama of the character of LaMotta, the character Bob was playing. So it was a major, major influence on me. As I said, it was reconstituted in 1983. And at that time, they made a new printing negative. And that negative, of course, became worn. So what we have finally now is this really wonderful restoration from the original camera negatives. It's interesting, the range of people who are fascinated by the picture and obsessed by it. Bernardo Bertolucci and his father Attilio really admired the film greatly. David Mamet, Wes Anderson, Stephen Fry, Elvis Costello, just to name a few. And in 1985, when the National Film Theater showed the reconstituted version, Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger were there. And at that show, when they were called to the stage, Michael came onto the stage, and the first thing he said was, 40 years ago.
How do you know what sort of a fella I was when I was as young as you were? 40 years ago.
40 years ago.
This phrase, 40 years ago, that's the one that takes us on a journey into the past in the film. Very apt for the occasion because it's a film about time and loss and memory. And every time I see it again, every time I revisit it, which is once or twice a year, I guess, it grows and it becomes much more enduring, moving, more profound. It's the same film that was made in '43, but I see more and more in it. There have been great films that I've watched countless times over the years, but this one I feel more comfortable with, what it says about growing and then having to let go. Now, the film was successful in England when it came out, but it's interesting because it was successful at a price. There's a dialogue that occurred between Michael Powell and the Ministry of Information. They had this dialogue before the film was about to be made, when he was having all this resistance. And Michael asked the Minister of Information, finally, he said, "So you're not going to cooperate with us?" And the minister answered, "No. Please don't make the film, or the old man is going to get really upset, very upset." Michael looked at him and said, "Are you forbidding us to make the film?" The minister said, "Oh, no, don't say that. This is a democracy. But please don't make the film, or you'll never get a K." So Emmerich and Michael walked out of the room. By the way, Emmerich Pressburger was living in England at the time, of course, and he had made all these films for the war effort, but yet he was still considered an enemy alien. In fact, Anton Boberg's speech later about the Nazis is really Emmerich Pressburger, in a sense. It's all done in one take. So Emmerich says to Michael, "What are we going to do?" And Michael said, "We're going to make the film." And of course, they never got the knighthood, the K. But they got the picture, and now so do you. So I really hope you appreciate it.